After my relatively simple stay in Montreal, the next leg of my adventure led me to the birthplace of democracy, Greece. With my final destination of Australia, I chose Greece for a number of reasons. Primarily because James, a now staple of this channel, and his partner Janice had spent the last 5 months there, leading dive tours at various resorts. James's family is from Greece, and thus he's spent a lot of time there, even before this trip. He can speak Greek and knows the customs and landscape well. I also figured that Greece was a good stepping stone to dip my toe into a place that has a fairly different culture than Canada. 3 weeks in Quebec was different enough from Vancouver, but with this being my first international, kind of solo travel, I figured Greece was different enough while still being safe. My flight was supposed to land in Athens in the mid-afternoon, but due to a delay, I ended up landing at 9 p.m. on a Saturday night. Getting through the small sidewalks and dense crowds of central Athens with my travel pack was an experience. But I made it to the hostel safely, and I was quite pleased to discover the view of the acropolis from the terrace. Hey everybody! I just wanted to address the fact that I don't have the time and frankly the knowledge to even begin to scratch the surface of the history of all the places I went to. There's tons of information online. You can always go and check out more there if you want. I'll also say that when he returned to Vancouver, James started a blog about how texts from thousands of years ago have survived to the modern day. Definitely check that out. I'll put a link in the bottom. James's degree is in anthropology. This stuff is his bread and butter, so definitely check it out if you're interested in that. I felt really privileged to get the opportunity to travel Greece with James and all the knowledge that he has. It was a great experience. I'm very grateful for it. But yeah, we'll get back to the movie now. The next 3 days were a blur of marble, history, good food, Eastern Orthodox churches, and cats. Greece has a real feral cat problem, but that's all I'll say on that matter. On my first day in Athens, I walked Ermau Street, a pedestrian-only street that is lined with shops and food. Right at the center of Ermau Street is an 1100-year-old church. I also visited the Benaki Museum of Greek Art, Culture, and History, where they had artifacts dating back to over 8,000 years ago, long before what we consider classical Greece. I did some walking tour podcasts to learn about the city of Athens before calling it a night. The next day was Acropolis Day, and I'm sure I don't have the words to describe what it felt like to walk around the 2,000-year-old marble building. The walking tour I was listening to, by Rick Steves, did an awesome job of putting me in the right headspace. I felt like I was floating through everything. The lines between past and present became blurred. I was following the footsteps of some of the most celebrated people in history. Before ascending all the way up to the Acropolis, I passed 2 major theaters. The first was the Theater of Dionysus, which at its peak likely had a capacity of 25,000 people. The second was the Theater of Herodes Atticus, which can seat 5,000 people and is still in use today. I then ascended the hill and passed through the Propylaea to reveal the majestic Parthenon. An amazing feat of engineering and architecture, even by modern standards. But it's not just the Parthenon that makes the Acropolis so exciting. There's also the Temple of Athena Nike and the Erechtheion. All these structures have thousands of years of history, surviving conquests and defeat, changing hands between different empires as they rose and fell. Yet the marble is still standing, fastidious and proud. Many of the artifacts from the Parthenon had been moved to safely be stored at Parthenon Museum, just at the foot of the hill, which is one of the most advanced museums in the world when it comes to preserving artifacts. This was a regular theme with many of the ancient locations I visited. The parts that were severely weathered would be moved and safely stored for viewing at a nearby climate-controlled facility to ensure its longevity. From the acropolis, there is a fantastic view of the sprawling city of Athens, where 1/4 of all Greeks live. From above, you get a better view of the size and scale of the Theater of Dionysus. It's believed that the seating would have gone all the way up the hill. On my third day in Athens, James and Janice were going to be arriving at the hostel in the late afternoon. But before they arrived, I headed to the ancient Agora of Athens, the center of ancient Athens, and the location where the idea of democracy was first discussed and eventually written into law. The most impressively preserved monument here was the Temple of Hephaestus. Much like the Parthenon, through the years, the use of this temple has changed many times, including becoming a Christian church around 700 AD. The most prominent feature of the Agora is the Stoa of Attalos, rebuilt and reopened to the public in 1956. It was built using much of the original foundation and features, and, where needed, materials were used from quarries that would have been used in ancient Greece in an attempt to get it reconstructed as close to the original as possible. The results are outstanding. One of the first things I noticed was the importance of using white marble. It was a hot day in mid-October, pushing into the upper 20s. Stepping into the shade of the Stoa, with the cool white marble reflecting heat out and away, acted as a natural air conditioner. It was exceptionally comfortable in the veranda. Also, note how the pillars are smooth at the base. This is from the original design thousands of years ago, to encourage people to lean against them and take a load off while shopping and doing other activities. The Stoa now primarily acts as a museum for the artifacts of the Agora. This contraption was used to randomly select people for jury duty, and this is one of 2 stele in which democracy was written into law, or more accurately, made tyranny illegal. I could spend an hour talking about the history of the Agora. After all, it was the heart of ancient Greece for thousands of years. I could talk about the Tholos, where democracy was likely first discussed among political officials. I could talk about the Pan-Athenaic Way, where every 4 years a parade of thousands of people would begin the journey up to the Parthenon, where they would put a new cape over the 40-foot statue of Athena that used to reside within. I could talk about how until the early 1900s people were still living in and using the area as a market before the Greek government decided to begin excavations in the area. I could talk about the multiple temples, stoas, and public buildings, including libraries and theaters. But what really stood out to me was the infrastructure. Like the gutters cut into the side of the road, draining into an ancient open sewer and stormwater system. The old water clock that would be filled at the same time every morning to keep track of the day, and the well used to collect that water. For some reason, these small and relatively insignificant features impressed me the most. Maybe it's because the need to redirect rainwater or keep track of time humanizes the ancient Greeks and allowed me to connect with them on a more basic level. While a building with 24 20-foot tall solid marble columns is impressive, it doesn't mean anything if it floods. Similarly, it wasn't just great philosophers and generals and politicians that made ancient Greece great. It was the everyman, the merchant, the tradesman, the entertainer. Ancient Greece wouldn't have survived if it weren't for the little man making sure that everything continued to run smoothly. Now, that was all pretty heavy. So here's a video of a tortoise bullying another tortoise to lighten things up. I eventually re-entered modern society to meet up with James and Janice at the hostel. We went up to Areopagus Hill, which used to be the location of the Supreme Court of Ancient Athens, where we took this photo. Imagine trying to explain a selfie to Plato. We continued to roam around the city, chatting, drinking, and enjoying the sights into the night. The next day, we rented a car and made our way to the island of Evia, where James's family owns an apartment, which we would be staying at for the next 2 nights. On the rooftop of the building, we had a view of the ocean. This was suburban Greece, with a more laid-back vibe where people could raise families. I felt privileged to stay here, not just because of the free accommodation, but because it allowed me to see a different side of Greece. 1 in 4 Greeks live in Athens, so it's pretty densely populated. Getting out of the city and seeing the slower day-to-day is an experience most tourists don't get. While on Evia, we spent a day driving a loop up to the northeast coast and back down. The scenery was spectacular, with rolling hills, sunbeams, small villages tucked away in the hillsides, turquoise water, and herds of goats that we sometimes had to stop for. The next day, we drove north along the west coast of Evia. Stopping at a coastal town, we wandered the streets, got some food, and went for a swim. We continued our sightseeing drive up the northern tip, where we slept in a hotel to catch a ferry across to the mainland first thing the next morning. More driving and more scenery eventually got us to Meteora, a UNESCO World Heritage Site of 6 Eastern Orthodox monasteries, precariously built on massive stone pillars rising out of the ground. The oldest ones were likely built in the 13th century, and at its peak there were 24 operating monasteries, with just 6 remaining today. Tourists are allowed to visit under a small fee of €3-ish, with the money going towards maintaining the impressive structures. We spent the next 3 days checking out the monasteries, hiking the hills, and staying at a cozy little hotel with an amazing view of some of the rock formations. Much like my time in Athens, my time in Meteora now feels more like a dream than a memory. Unfortunately, I didn't take a lot of photos and videos inside because I wanted to respect the grounds. The monasteries of Meteora were originally established to protect Eastern Orthodox Christians from political and religious persecution, and provide priests and nuns safe places to work on their studies. When originally built, the only way to access most of the monasteries was by a rope ladder that could be raised if the monks felt threatened. If an individual was uncomfortable with the climb, the only other option was getting hauled up in a cargo net. When asked how the monks knew it was time to replace the rope, the only response given was, "When God decides." Thankfully, all the active monasteries are now accessible by either bridge or stairway. We did one hike that took us around the backside of one of the rock formations, with a view of an old abandoned monastery jutting out from the side of a cliff. Another hike we did took us up to an old chapel dug into the side of a cliff. As we walked back down from that hike, we came across a wild pomegranate tree, cracked into one. Very delicious on the hot Greek day. The 2 main towns at the base of Meteora are Kalabaka and Kastraki. In Kalabaka, there is a church that is almost 2,000 years old. As with most buildings of this age, regular maintenance means that much of it has been replaced, but there is one section covered by a glass plate that shows the original floor. After drifting through the history of Eastern Orthodoxy for 3 days, we hit the road again. This time heading to the famous site of Delphi. We went through a mountain pass, gaining some elevation, where we found ourselves driving through a forest of coniferous trees. For a brief moment I felt like I was teleported back to the mountain roads of British Columbia. We descended back down to the flatlands and made a side trip to Thermopylae, or as you may know it, the site of the Battle of 300. Driving up the mountain that Delphi was built on gives amazing views of the valley below, where tens of thousands of olive trees grow. We eventually reached the town of modern Delphi, where we had a hotel booked. Our room had an amazing balcony that overlooked the valley with a slight view of the ocean. The next morning, we headed into the archaeological site of ancient Delphi. Modern Delphi used to actually be built on this site, but buildings were moved to allow for excavation in the late 1800s, after a large earthquake and landslide had opened up the possibility of moving the town and accessing the ruins of ancient Delphi. You may recognize the name Delphi. It was known as the belly button of the ancient world. Delphi literally translates to womb or belly button. It was an important economic hub, and people would travel for hundreds of miles to visit, and thus many of the tribes built treasuries, where they would store valuables to showcase their accomplishments and victories over the years. One of the more prominent treasuries is that of the Athenians, reconstructed to showcase what it looked like in its prime. James pointed out, it's interesting how thousands of years ago, Athenians were donating time and money to Delphi, either for the treasury or otherwise. And today, thousands of years later, the Athenian government, though now part of the same country, still does the same. Of course, the most important piece of information about Delphi is the Oracle, who would give her predictions here in the Temple of Apollo. I'll stay out of the nitty-gritty on this one, as there are stacks of books about the Oracle at Delphi, but the culture of having an Oracle at Delphi was around for hundreds of years. The Oracle was a woman chosen by mystical means that would provide advice on how people should plan their future. People would visit the Oracle for everything from deciding what crops to plant to deciding who to attack and when. On the day of consultation, which didn't happen often, the Oracle would sit in the Temple of Apollo, and the guests would enter and ask her recommendation on a decision that was plaguing them. She would then provide prophecies through ambiguous poems that couldn't be refuted one way or the other. There are some interesting theories about how the temple was built atop a small crack in the ground that would release gas, and led to hysteria among the oracles, and there appears to be geological evidence to suggest that is possible. If you look at this photo of the outer wall of the Temple of Apollo, you can see that these bricks aren't perfectly straight, an indication of geological activity in that specific spot. Greeks were exceedingly skilled when it came to engineering rock slabs and building temples, and something as important as the Temple of Apollo wouldn't be built with such shoddy craftsmanship. At the top of the road that zigzags up the mountainside, known as the Sacred Way, is the Stadium of Delphi. The Pythian Games were held at this stadium, the second biggest sporting event after the Olympics. One of the things that stood out to me the most about Delphi was how almost every stone that wasn't part of a temple had something written on it. There were hundreds, if not thousands of stones with writing. To translate them all must have been, or continues to be, a massive undertaking. So much information. Apparently on one of the blocks, just before the Temple of Apollo, there is an inscription that is the earliest recording of referencing the Greek people as a single entity, instead of several disparate tribes across the land. About half a kilometer down the road from Delphi is the sanctuary of Athena Pranaya, which is where the iconic Tholos of Athena stand. The sanctuary was the gateway to ancient Delphi, and the first place seen by weary travelers who would have arrived after traveling hundreds of miles to get to Delphi. 3 of the original 20 columns have been rebuilt using parts of the original columns. You may have noticed throughout this video that many of the marble temples and structures have both white and gray marble incorporated into them. The whiter marble is actually new, added in by restoration specialists, using 3D modeling and laser precision to cut and attach new pieces of rock to replace pieces that have broken off over the millennia. We spent that evening in a small coastal town about 45 minutes out of Delphi called Galaxidi. We wandered around the water, had some food, and stumbled across a horde of feral cats, which I befriended. There was a bit of an awkward encounter with the man who lived in the building where the cats were hanging around, but I won't get into that. We then made our way back to Evia for my final night in Greece. We watched 300 to celebrate the visit to Thermopylae. The next morning, James and Janice drove me to the airport in Athens, so I could begin my 37-hour journey to Australia. International travel is new to me. I've spent most of my life seeking nature-based adventures. I have an idea of the things I enjoy and why I enjoy doing them, and I have spent years mulling it over in my head and figuring out how to verbalize those experiences. I figured I could probably lean on that ability to discuss travel. But now that I've begun my international journey, I find myself struggling to find a way to share the experience with my audience. It's so easy to look at another place through a screen and know that it exists, but it's still foreign. For you, it doesn't really exist. A place is just a place. Either you are there or you aren't. The same is true for time. I find myself once again coming back to the concept of scale, but now I'm wrestling with the scale of time. As I've touched on before, my brief stint in Greece now feels like a dream. Walking around major archaeological sites like the Acropolis or Delphi was surreal. The civilizations of Canada and the United States are exceptionally young, and that is even more true of the West Coast, where I grew up. My view of time is very skewed because of this. You can tell me that people lived in Europe for thousands of years, and I can see pictures and videos on a screen. But then the image changes and I move on. Being able to physically step into the history of Greece, where people have lived for thousands of years, is a gift I think may be overlooked by the average North American. Before going to Greece, I was blown away by the age of old Quebec City and Montreal. Now, those timelines feel like an insignificant sneeze in the history of humanity, and rightly so. And what's perhaps more interesting, as James pointed out to me, is that what we view and celebrate as classical Greece, with its gods, philosophers, scientists, mathematicians, and artists, is only so big in modern culture because it's been decided that is the part of Greek history that we want to celebrate. Before the classical Greek civilization, there were the Cycladic, Minoan, and Mycenaean civilization. The classical Greek period ended when the Romans conquered Greece in 168 BC. Although they were so impressed with how sophisticated the Greek culture was, instead of assimilating Greeks, they actually supported them. Until the Byzantine period, when Rome began to split apart, and then Greece was conquered by the Ottomans in the 15th century. Civilizations and superpowers rise and fall, from the lowest beggar to the greatest emperor. Greeks, Romans, Persians, Mongolians, the Dutch, the Brits, Americans. The world is dynamic, and as Outcast says, nothing lasts forever. So much is lost to time, and it's foolish to think that any one group is better or more sophisticated than another. And maybe that is what this all culminates to. When I spend time in the mountains, I can look at a mountain and have the knowledge of the way the tectonic plates move, and know that it took millions of years for it to form. But really understanding it, that's different. Timescales are extremely difficult things to grasp beyond just a couple years. On top of that, I'm not a mountain. I can't relate to it. Visiting the ancient ruins of Greece put time in a context that was relatable. I understand buildings. I understand the concepts of science, art, and politics. I can look at the world I live in now and see the world that it was born from. I can look at a modern building dedicated to the soldiers of war, with its marble columns and intricate frieze, and relate to those who lived in the Agora or visited the Parthenon, who were looking at the same type of structure. Even though we are separated by thousands of years, different cultures, languages, and technology, I now have some way of understanding and conceptualizing the passage of time the shifting of culture, and the changing of human civilization. I now have a way to understand the past. And maybe that's why my time in Greece feels like such a dream. The way I view the world changed, and my brain needed time to adapt to the new, exponentially larger universe that I now live in.
I think we'll set up the monastery here.